My husband auctioned me at his party. $500 for this queer's wife. He smirked until a stranger offered $100 million. Welcome to her revenge. Here's something special. My new story.
At the housewarming party inside our $25 million mansion, my husband raised his glass in front of 63 guests, placed his hand on my shoulder like I was a piece of furniture, and smirked. $500. Does anyone want to take this useless decoration off my hands? The entire room went dead silent. I stood there without crying, without arguing back, because the livestream camera was still on. Then from the back of the room, a man stood up, his voice cold as a blade. $100 million. My husband's smile froze. Welcome to her revenge. Stay, because this story is just getting started. Honestly, I'm so thankful you chose to stay. Now tell me something. Where in the world are you right now? Drop your city or country below. Let's build something here together. Quick note. Portions of this story include fictional elements included purely for educational and entertainment purposes. Similarities to any names or places are coincidental, but the lesson underneath it all, that one belongs to everyone. It was the last week of September 2024, and the Hamptons hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to be summer or fall. The light outside came in sideways through the tall windows of our $25 million estate, the particular slant that only exists in that 1 hour before a party begins, when everything looks golden and nothing has gone wrong yet. I was standing in the dressing room on the second floor, fastening the clasp on my left earring. Pearl. Simple. Exactly the kind of thing that reads as effortless when you've spent 14 years learning what effortless is supposed to look like. The room around me was immaculate. Cream walls, built-in shelving lined with the kind of objects that get described in magazines as curated. A Persian rug in muted ivory and sage that I'd sourced from a dealer in Connecticut after rejecting 4 others. Sconces that cast a warm, deliberate light, not the harsh overhead kind that makes people look tired. I had specified the bulb temperature myself, 2700 Kelvin. The contractor had looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. I'd written it down and handed it to him anyway. Every detail in this house had passed through my hands before it became permanent. The architect, a firm out of Boston that Declan had never heard of before I put their portfolio in front of him. The structural modifications to the east wing, the kitchen layout, the placement of every door, every window, every square foot of outdoor terrace. None of this was accidental. None of it was Declan's instinct. He had signed the checks. I had made the decisions. That was in essence the entire architecture of our marriage. I heard him before I saw him, the low cadence of his voice carrying through the hallway, fluid and confident. The voice of a man who had been performing for rooms full of people for so long that he no longer distinguished between performance and conversation. He appeared in the doorway of the dressing room for approximately 4 seconds. "You look fine," he said. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. His eyes were on his phone, scrolling through something that required more of his attention than his wife did on the night of the largest party we had ever hosted. Then he was gone, already halfway down the hall, already mid-sentence with whoever was on the other end of the call. I watched the empty doorway for a moment. 14 years of that. 14 years of, "You look fine," delivered to the back of a room. 14 years of being the person who made everything work while remaining carefully and consistently invisible. I had told myself for a long time that I preferred it that way, that the work was the point, not the recognition. I had believed that, or something close enough to it, for longer than I care to admit. I picked up my phone from the vanity. The first message was from Bryce Harlow, a lifestyle content creator with just over 4 million followers across his platforms. Known for his coverage of high-end real estate and social events along the East Coast. I had reached out to him 3 weeks ago through his management team, framing the invitation as an opportunity to document what I'd described as An intimate housewarming at one of the Hamptons' most architecturally significant private residences. He had confirmed immediately. His message read, "Pulling up now. Team of 3. Ready when you are." Straightforward. Professional. Exactly what I needed. The second message was from Helen Marsh, my attorney, a woman who had spent 20 years specializing in high-asset divorce and estate law in New York, and who communicated exclusively in sentences that contained no unnecessary words. Everything is in order. Holloway Trust documentation is clean and filed. Tonight is your night, Sarah. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the vanity. The Holloway Trust. I wasn't going to explain that tonight, not to anyone, not even to myself in the quiet of this room. There would be time for explanations later. Tonight required something else entirely. I looked at myself in the mirror. Navy dress. Simple cut. The earrings. Hair pulled back in a way that had taken 40 minutes and was designed to look like it had taken 5. The face looking back at me was composed, which was the correct word for it. Not calm, not happy, not anxious. Composed. Like a piece of music that has been practiced until the effort disappears. I had learned this particular expression over many years and many rooms full of people who were watching Declan while standing next to me. From somewhere below, I heard the first sound of tires on the gravel drive, then a second set. Then voices, the warm carrying voices of people who were arriving somewhere they were glad to be, who had dressed carefully and expected to be seen. 63 guests. I had reviewed the final list 4 times. I knew every name, every professional connection, every relationship to Declan, and to the handful of people on that list who were connected instead to me. I knew the seating I'd arranged on the terrace. I knew the flow of the catering service, the timing of the past appetizers the moment the string trio would transition from background music to something people might actually notice. I knew all of it because I had built all of it, the same way I had built the business that made this house possible, the same way I had built the reputation that filled this guest list. The same way I had built the version of Declan Vance that people in that driveway were arriving to celebrate. I fastened the second earring, smoothed the front of my dress, and picked up my phone one more time. For 14 years, I had walked into rooms like this one step behind my husband, carrying everything that made the room possible, while he carried the credit for it. Tonight was different. Tonight. For the first time in all those years, I had not prepared this evening for Declan. Every call I had made, every detail I had managed, every person I had placed on that guest list, I had done it for myself. For what came after? The voices outside were getting louder. The party was beginning. I took one last look in the mirror, then walked out of the dressing room without looking back. By 7 o'clock, the estate had transformed into something that looked completely effortless, which meant I had spent 11 days making sure it would. The main floor was full without feeling crowded. Candlelight moved across crystal and polished marble. A string trio in the corner of the great room played at exactly the right volume, present enough to fill silence, quiet enough that no one had to raise their voice. Out on the south terrace, the bar was open and the ocean was doing what the ocean does at dusk in the Hamptons, making everyone feel like they'd made the right decision by being here. I moved through all of it the way I had learned to move through rooms like this, smoothly, purposefully, without drawing attention to the fact that I was the reason any of it was running. A word with the catering lead about the timing of the past courses. A quiet redirect when a server nearly placed a tray of oysters too close to the edge of the terrace railing. A 2-minute conversation with a couple near the fireplace, Richard and Anne Caldwell neighbors, 2 properties east, who had attended every significant event on this stretch of coastline for the past decade. "Extraordinary house," Richard said, gesturing broadly at the ceiling. "Thank you," I said. "Declan worked very hard on it." I said that the way I always said it, smoothly, without hesitation. 14 years of practice will do that. Bryce Harlow arrived at 7:15 with a camera operator and a sound technician, a compact, efficient team that knew how to move through a space without disrupting it. Bryce himself was in his early 30s, easy-looking, the kind of person who could make standing in a room seem like an event. He had built his following covering the intersection of architecture, wealth, and lifestyle along the East Coast, and his presence at an event like this carried a specific kind of legitimacy that no press release could replicate. I crossed the room to meet him near the entrance. "Bryce," I said, "glad you made it. You have full access tonight, just like we discussed." "This place," he said, looking up at the entry hall. "Sarah, this is incredible." "Feel free to move wherever the story takes you," I told him. The guests were informed in the invitation. That last part was true and deliberate. 3 weeks ago, when I finalized the guest list, I had added a single line to the bottom of the printed invitation. "This event will be documented for lifestyle and media coverage. Attendance constitutes consent to photography and filming. Standard language for Hampton's events with press access." No one had called to object. No one ever did, because no one reads the bottom of an invitation when the top says $25 million estate and open bar. Bryce nodded, his camera operator already moving. The live stream light blinked on small red steady. I returned to the room and kept moving. It was near the far end of the great room, close to the windows that faced the water, that I first saw her. She was with a man named Carter Ellis, a commercial real estate broker who had worked with Declan on 2 projects in the past 3 years and who had RSVP'd with a +1 I hadn't previously placed. Madison Cole, 32 years old. Dark hair, minimal jewelry, a dress that was expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself. She was holding a glass of white wine and not drinking it. What I noticed first was not her appearance. It was the way she was standing, slightly angled away from the conversation happening beside her, her attention moving across the room in slow, methodical intervals, not searching for someone, not performing interest, cataloging. The way a person stands when they're gathering information rather than enjoying a party. I had seen that posture before. In boardrooms, in due diligence meetings, in people who were paid to notice things other people missed. I kept my pace even and continued past her toward the terrace. 40 minutes later, Declan found me near the bar. He had been working the room the way he always did, moving from group to group with the particular ease of someone who had been told often enough, and by enough important people, that he was worth listening to. He looked exactly the way I had designed him to look: confident, polished, the kind of man a room instinctively organizes itself around. He leaned in close enough that only I could hear him. "I'm going to do something fun tonight," he said. "A little toast. Something to keep things interesting." "What kind of toast?" I asked. "The entertaining kind." He pulled back and looked at me with the expression he used when he thought he was being charming. "Don't make a face, Sarah. Just let me have this one." He moved away before I could respond, already catching the eye of someone across the room, already transitioning into the next version of the performance. I watched him go. Then I smiled quietly to myself in the way that had nothing to do with what he'd just said. He thought tonight was his. He had been thinking that for 14 years. I raised my glass slightly, as if toasting no one in particular, and turned back toward the room. It happened 2 hours into the party, when the champagne had done its work, and the room had settled into that particular warmth where people feel safe enough to laugh at things they shouldn't. Declan tapped the side of his champagne flute with one finger. The sound was small but precise, and the room responded the way rooms always responded to Declan: immediately and with attention. He was standing near the center of the great room, exactly where the light was best. That was never accidental with him. In 14 years, I had never once seen Declan Vance position himself badly in a room. "I want to say a few words," he began, "because I think this house deserves them." There was a warmth in his voice that I recognized. Not genuine warmth. Declan's genuine warmth was a quieter thing, rarer, something I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. This was performance warmth, the kind that filled rooms and made people lean forward. He talked about the house. He talked about what it represented: the years of work, the vision, the commitment to building something lasting. He was good at this. I had always known he was good at this. I had in fact spent considerable effort making sure he had enough material to be good at it. The room was with him. You could feel it, that slight collective softening, the way 63 people quietly decide without discussing it that they like someone. Then he paused. He turned, found me across the room, and smiled. It was the smile I had learned to read years ago, the one that meant he had decided something and wasn't going to ask permission first. "Come here for a second," he said, gesturing toward me with 2 fingers. Not a wave, not an invitation. The kind of gesture you use to call someone over who works for you. I crossed the room. I kept my hands loose at my sides. I kept my face exactly as it was. He put his hand on my shoulder the moment I reached him. Not an arm around the shoulders, not a side embrace. A hand placed flat on the top of my shoulder. The way you'd rest your hand on a piece of furniture you were about to describe. "This," he said, turning back to the room, "is my wife Sarah. 14 years, which I think deserves some recognition." Applause. Polite, genuine enough. A few smiles directed my way. "Sarah manages everything," Declan continued. "The house, the calendar, the logistics. She is without question the most organized woman I have ever met." He paused for timing. He always paused for timing. "She is also, and I say this with complete affection, the least interesting person at this party." A beat of silence. Then scattered laughter, the uncertain kind, the kind people produce when they're not sure if they've been given permission to find something funny. Declan smiled wider. He had his permission. 36 years old, he said, and already out of season. She doesn't network. She doesn't golf. She reorganizes closets for fun and considers it a big Friday night. More laughter now, easier, the room warming to him again, the way it always did. She thinks she runs this house. He tilted his head slightly. Bless her heart. What she actually runs is my credit card. I stood in the circle of his arm and I did not move. My hands were still. My face held the same expression it had been holding for the past 30 seconds, a faint cooperative smile, the one I had practiced for exactly these moments. Not stiff. Not wounded, simply present. Inside I was cataloging. The couple near the fireplace, she had stopped laughing and was looking at her drink. The man to Declan's left, a hedge fund manager from Greenwich, was smiling, but his eyes weren't in it. Near the back of the room, I could see the small red light of Bryce Harlow's camera. Steady, unblinking, recording everything. "So," Declan said, raising his glass, "in the spirit of this new home, and in the spirit of generosity, I am making a very limited time offer." His voice had taken on the cadence of a pitch, smooth and confident and absolutely certain of its own cleverness. $500 to whoever wants to take this decoration off my hands for the evening. He squeezed my shoulder once, the way you'd pat a dog. Think of it as charity for anyone who needs a housekeeper. The room did not laugh, not immediately, not the way Declan had expected. There was a half-second of the wrong kind of silence, not the comfortable silence of a joke landing, but the tight, airless silence of 63 people simultaneously deciding what their face was supposed to be doing. A few people laughed. Quietly, quickly, the way you laugh when you want to move past something. A few more looked away. Declan kept his smile in place. He was good at that too, holding a smile while scanning a room that wasn't giving him what he wanted. I had watched him do it in boardrooms for years. It looked confident from a distance. Up close, I could see the slight recalibration behind his eyes. I said nothing. I stood in the circle of his hand on my shoulder and I looked at the room, at the candlelight, at the crystal, at the 63 people who had come tonight because they believed Declan Vance was worth their Saturday evening. And I waited. Because from the back of the room, from the chair near the east window, the one I had placed there 3 weeks ago when I finalized the seating arrangement, a man's voice cut through the silence. Calm, unhurried, not loud, but every person in that room heard every word. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I had recognized that voice the moment it cut through the room, even after 16 years. Callum Price stepped out from the east side of the great room without any particular urgency. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit with no tie, no watch on his wrist, no pocket square, nothing that announced itself. In a room full of men who had dressed with careful precision to signal exactly how much they were worth, he was the only one who hadn't bothered, which, in its own quiet way, communicated something considerably larger than any of them. He crossed to the center console table, the long, marble-topped piece between the two main seating areas, and set an envelope down on its surface. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate. The way you place a document you've already reviewed 3 times and found entirely satisfactory. Then he straightened, clasped his hands loosely in front of him, and looked at Declan. $100 million, he said. His voice was level, nearly conversational. The kind of voice that has never needed volume because the words themselves have always been sufficient. The room responded the way rooms respond when something genuinely unexpected happens, not with noise, but with its absence. Glasses paused, conversations dropped mid-sentence. The string trio continued playing in the corner, but for the first time all evening no one could hear them. Declan stared at him. 1 beat, 2. Then the smile came back slower than usual, more deliberate, the smile of a man who has decided that confidence is the only available move. "I'm sorry," Declan said, his voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who manages situations for a living. "Did you just—" 100 million, Callum said again, with the patience of a man who doesn't mind repeating himself because he has never once been wrong about something worth repeating. 500 covers the price you just placed on your wife. The remainder retires the outstanding mortgage on this property. A brief pause. In full. Tonight. Declan let out a short laugh. Nobody writes a check at a party. I do, Callum said. When the occasion calls for it. This is... Declan shook his head slowly, still smiling, still working. Look, I don't know who you are, but this is clearly a misunderstanding. Callum Price. Price Logistics. He said it the way people say things that don't require elaboration. And I don't believe there's been any misunderstanding. You set a price. I met it. He glanced once at the envelope on the table, then back up. With considerable interest. The silence that settled after that was a different kind than the one that had followed Declan's toast. That silence had been uncomfortable, searching, waiting for someone to laugh so everyone else could. This one was still. Attentive. The room had stopped performing and started watching. I stood at the edge of the circle and looked at Callum Price for the first time in 16 years. He had changed the way people change when they've spent a decade and a half actually building something, not just the surface changes of age, but something underneath. A settledness, a certainty about the space he occupied. The silver in his hair had started coming in when he was in his late 30s. I knew that because I had known him then, in the years before any of this, before Price Logistics, before the Hamptons, before Declan Vance existed in either of our lives as anything more than a problem to be managed. What I felt looking at him now was not what people would expect me to feel. Not relief, not gratitude, not the particular lightness of someone being rescued. What I felt was the precise, quiet satisfaction of watching something you built with great care finally do exactly what it was designed to do. A plan arriving at its moment. 2 years of careful work becoming visible in the span of 40 seconds. He had come when he said he would. Exactly as we had agreed in a coffee shop on 47th Street on a rainy Tuesday in March of 2022. With 2 cups of coffee between us and the city moving past the windows and Callum saying quietly, "When you're ready, tell me where to sit," and me sliding a piece of paper across the table with a floor plan and a chair marked in blue ink. East window, 3rd seat from the left. He had kept that piece of paper. I knew because he'd mentioned it once months later with something in his voice that I recognized as the closest Callum Price ever got to sentiment. Declan tried once more. All right, he said, dropping his voice to the register he used for closing rooms lower, more private, more reasonable. I appreciate the theatrics, genuinely. But this isn't. Your wife, Callum said, could tell you more about my company than I could about yours right now. I suspect she could tell you more about most things than you've been giving her credit for. He said it without edge, simply as a statement of fact that happened to land like something considerably sharper. That was my observation. You're welcome to disagree with it. Something moved across Declan's face, small, quick. There and gone in under a second, but I had spent 14 years reading that face across dinner tables and boardroom calls, and the quiet mornings when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I knew exactly what that expression was. It was the first moment of genuine uncertainty I had ever seen in him. He looked at me. I held his gaze. Nothing more. No expression, no communication, no small reassuring gesture of the kind I had spent years producing on instinct to smooth over exactly this kind of moment. I simply looked back. Around the room, I could see people had lowered their champagne glasses and raised their phones instead. Not to make calls, to check screens. The man standing 3 feet to my left had Bryce's livestream open 47,000 viewers, the number ticking upward in real time with the steady, indifferent momentum of something that had already decided to become significant. Declan saw it. I watched the exact moment his eyes found the number, processed it, and understood in the way that a man who has spent 14 years carefully constructing a public image always understands precisely what 47,000 witnesses represented for everything he had built. His smile remained. That was the thing about Declan Vance. The smile never collapsed all at once. It stayed, but it hollowed out, present on the surface, evacuated underneath. I had seen it happen in difficult meetings. I had seen it happen when a deal went sideways. I had never seen it happen to him personally, in a room full of his own guests with a camera running, until now. I looked at him for one full, deliberate moment, long enough to be a choice, long enough that it could not be mistaken for anything else. Then I stepped out of the circle. No explanation offered. No backward glance. No pause at the edge of the group to check whether anyone needed something from me the way I had paused at the edge of every room for 14 years. I walked toward the far side of the great room, and I did not look back. I walked until the voices from inside became indistinct, until the only sound was the water and the wind coming off the Atlantic. And then I stopped at the railing and let the September air do what September air does when you give it space. It smelled like salt and something ending. Standing there, I went back the way you go back, when the present suddenly makes the past legible not by choice, but because the door opens and you find yourself already through it. Queens, New York, October 2007. My father, Robert Holloway, had built his small real estate business over 22 years. Not a dynasty, not an empire, a modest, careful thing. A handful of residential properties in the outer boroughs, a reputation for being fair, a name that meant something on 2 or 3 streets in a neighborhood that most Manhattan brokers couldn't have found on a map. He was proud of it the way a man is proud of something he built with his hands. Then September 2008 hit the housing market like a freight train, and the freight train arrived early for people like my father. By October 2007, the first signs had already appeared, the tightening credit lines, the deals falling through the buyers who suddenly couldn't close. My father understood what was happening before most people in his position did. That was the cruelest part. He watched it coming and couldn't stop it. He filed for bankruptcy in November. 3 weeks later, he had a heart attack in the kitchen of the house I had grown up in. He was 54 years old. The people who disappeared surprised me less than the people who stayed. Which is to say, almost everyone disappeared, and I had not expected any of them to stay. Declan had been working for my father for 8 months, an entry-level broker who had charm and good instincts and very little else. We had been dating for 6 of those 8 months quietly, carefully, the way you date someone when you work adjacent to their father. When the bankruptcy news broke, Declan was gone within the week. No conversation. One text message that said, "I'm so sorry about everything. I need some space to figure things out," and then nothing for 3 months. I was 19 years old alone in a house full of my father's paperwork, and I did not have the bandwidth to be angry about it. I was too busy surviving. The person I did not expect was Callum. He had been my father's driver for 4 years, dependable, quiet, the kind of man who knew everything about a family simply because he was present for the ordinary moments no one thinks to hide. He showed up at the hospital the night my father died, still in his work clothes, and he did not ask what I needed. He simply stayed. He arranged the funeral. He made the calls I couldn't make. He paid the funeral home $8,400, his entire savings, and when I found out and tried to reimburse him, he said only, "Mr. Holloway would have done the same for me." What I didn't know then, what I would only piece together years later, was that driving for my father had been Callum's deliberate choice, not his ceiling. He had spent those 4 years watching how a small business was built and where it was vulnerable. When the market collapsed in 2008, he had already been saving. He incorporated price logistics in 2009, starting with 2 contracted routes and a used truck. By the time he called me in March 2022, he was running a firm with operating revenue in the 9 figures. He had never mentioned any of it. That too was characteristic. I believed him. My father had been that kind of man. It was 2 weeks after the funeral, while I was going through the business files, that I found the document. A personal guarantee. Callum's name on it, dated 14 months earlier. My father had needed a small bridge loan, $60,000, to cover a gap between a sale closing and a new purchase. The lender had required a co-signer. My father had asked Callum, and Callum had signed, because my father had asked him to. And because Callum trusted my father the way you trust someone who has treated you with consistent decency for 4 years. When the business collapsed, the debt transferred. I found the document on a Tuesday evening. I spent Wednesday and Thursday reading every piece of contract law I could access through the public library's legal database. I had grown up watching my father read contracts at the kitchen table. Had learned early that the details were always in the language everyone skipped. On Friday morning, I called Callum. "Did you know there's a hardship restructuring provision in the guarantee agreement?" I asked him. A pause. "I don't know what that means." "It means, if you can demonstrate financial hardship to the lender document, your income, your assets, your inability to pay the full amount, you can negotiate a reduced settlement instead of the full $60,000. Lenders prefer 60 cents on the dollar over a bankruptcy filing that gets them nothing." Another pause, longer this time. "How do you know that?" "I read the agreement," I said. "All of it. Twice." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sarah, I'm the one who's supposed to be helping you right now." "You did help me," I said. "Now let me help you back." It took 6 weeks. 3 letters to the lender and 1 in-person meeting that Callum attended, and I prepared every word of. The lender accepted a settlement of $38,000, paid in installments over 18 months. Callum walked away with his credit intact and his personal assets untouched. He never forgot that. I know because he told me years later that the document I had handed him across that table was the reason he believed a person's intelligence could be worth more than their money. He had built an entire business philosophy around that idea. 3 months after my father's funeral, Declan reappeared. He was settled now, he said. He had a new position at a firm in Midtown. He missed me. He was sorry for disappearing the way he had. He'd needed time, he said, to get himself together, to be in a position where he could actually be present for someone. I was 19 years old. I was alone. The house felt enormous, and the silence in it was the kind that had a shape. So I let him in. Standing at the railing now, the Atlantic dark and steady in front of me, I didn't ask myself why I had believed him then. I understood exactly why. Grief makes you want something familiar, something that predates the loss, something that feels like continuity when everything else has been taken apart. What I asked myself on this particular September night 16 years later was something different. Not why did I let him in, but why did it take me 14 years to let him go? After my father died, I had two things left: a sharp mind and no money to put behind it. Declan had a little money and no idea what to do with it. In 2010, we got married, and I got to work. The first thing I built was the logo. I taught myself the design software, over a weekend produced 3 options, and presented them to Declan on a Sunday evening with a single-page brief explaining the positioning strategy behind each one. He chose the second option and said, "This is why I married you." He meant it as a compliment. I chose to take it as one. The pitch deck came next: 42 slides, every number verified. Every projection conservative enough to be credible and optimistic enough to be interesting. I had learned from watching my father that investors don't fund ideas, they fund the people presenting them. So I built the deck to make Declan look like someone worth funding. It worked. The first round closed in 11 weeks. After that, the pace became self-sustaining. I rebuilt my father's contact list: every broker, contractor, and property manager Robert Holloway had worked with in 22 years, and I made calls. I explained that the Holloway name was gone, but the relationships didn't have to be. Some people hung up. Most didn't. Within 18 months, Declan Vance had a network that should have taken a decade to assemble. He was good at using it. That was the thing I always acknowledged, even to myself, even later when acknowledging it became more complicated. Declan was genuinely good at the part that happened in the room: the handshakes, the read of a negotiation, the instinct for when to push and when to wait. What he wasn't good at, and what he never needed to be good at, was everything that happened before and after the room. That part was mine. By 2014, his name was on 3 significant commercial deals in Manhattan. By 2016, it was on 8. The company had a staff of 12, then 22, then 31. Each expansion required infrastructure, financial systems, vendor relationships, compliance frameworks, and each time the work landed on my desk under the title of Estate and Brand Manager, which was a clean way of describing a role that had no real boundary. Somewhere in those years, I stopped appearing in the materials. It wasn't a single decision. It was an accumulation of small ones: the email where my name got dropped from the CC line because someone assumed I was support staff; the profile piece where the journalist quoted only Declan because I was the one who had arranged the interview, and therefore didn't seem like a subject to the award dinner where Declan thanked his team, his investors, and his vision, in that order. I told myself it was strategy, that the power was in the architecture, not the credit, that what I was building mattered more than whether anyone could see me building it. I told myself that for 8 years. It is remarkable in retrospect how long a person can believe something that is slowly not true. In 2018, Forbes ran a profile on Declan Vance. 2,000 words, a full-page photograph, a sidebar on his investment philosophy. I had set up the interview, prepared the talking points, and reviewed the fact-check questions before they went to print. My name did not appear once. I read the piece at my desk alone on a Tuesday morning. Then I closed the browser and went back to work. That same year, I noticed the change in Declan's schedule. Not all at once, gradually, the way you notice a shift in weight distribution before you can identify what's moved. Dinners that ran later than they should have. A phone left face down on the kitchen counter when it had never been face down before. A Thursday evening marked client meeting in a calendar I managed with no client name attached. I didn't confront him. I watched. For 3 months, I watched. Then one evening in November, while he was in the shower, I picked up his phone. I read what I needed to read. Her name was Madison Cole. I set the phone back exactly where I had found it, face down, same angle. I went to my office, the one I had designed, in the apartment I had sourced in the building whose management company I had selected, and I sat down in my chair. I did not cry. That surprised me briefly. Then it didn't. What I felt sitting there was something quieter than grief and more durable than anger. It was clarity. The particular clarity that arrives when a thing you had been avoiding finally sits down across from you, and you realize you've known it was coming for longer than you admitted. I opened my laptop. The financial architecture of Declan Vance's business had always run through me. Every reporting system, every vendor contract, every account relationship I had built it, which meant I understood it better than anyone, including Declan, especially Declan. He had always received a management summary of the quarterly financials, a clean, readable document I prepared that covered the numbers he needed for conversations and decisions. The full reports, with their complete transaction records and subsidiary structures, lived in the filing system I maintained. He had never asked to see them. He trusted me. He had always trusted me, which was the most expensive mistake he ever made. Beginning that November, I started making adjustments, not to the real numbers, those stayed accurate, but to what flowed where. Several client relationships that existed within entities I controlled began transitioning quietly toward a different structure. The shell companies that handled certain vendor payments were legitimate registered entities. I had set them up years earlier for operational efficiency, and Declan knew they existed. What he didn't know was the precise ownership chain because he had never asked, and I had never volunteered it. He was smart enough to build a reputation. He was not detail-oriented enough to audit the foundation it sat on. That November, I began auditing it for him. The thinking took 4 years. The plan itself took 2 more. Tonight was the last night of it. I came back inside from the terrace to find the party had exhaled. Some guests had migrated to the outdoor bar on the east side of the house, drawn by the cooler air and the string lights I'd had installed along the garden path. Others had pulled chairs near the fireplace at the north end of the main room, settling into the kind of conversation that only happens after 2 hours and 2 drinks, unhurried, quieter, real. The room looked the same. The flowers were the same. The lighting hadn't changed. But it wasn't the same room it had been an hour ago, and I was the only person in it who fully understood why. I moved along the west wall, the way I always moved through large spaces I'd designed parallel to the perimeter, reading the clusters. I did it automatically, the way you check the locks on a door you've checked 100 times before. Not because you doubt the locks, because it's the kind of person you've become. Southwest Richard Caldwell with 2 men I recognized as limited partners in a commercial development fund based out of Chicago. I'd introduced Caldwell to both of them 14 months ago, at an event I'd organized in Tribeca. At the time, all 3 of them had logistics contracts with Declan's preferred vendor network. That wasn't true anymore. Northeast a woman named Sandra Okafor, corporate attorney 44, sharp enough that she'd noticed the media consent clause on the invitation and asked me about it 2 weeks before the party. I'd explained it plainly. She'd come anyway, which told me everything I needed to know about her judgment. Center Declan still working the room, laughing at something a man named Gerald Holt had just said. Gerald was a commercial real estate developer, mid-50s. The kind of man who had built his career on reading people correctly. He was laughing too. Neither of them looked like anything was wrong. Gerald had moved his logistics contract to Price Logistics 8 months ago. He hadn't told Declan. There hadn't been a reason to. I counted quietly as I moved. 27. In March of 2022, Callum called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk in the Midtown office, the glass-partitioned one that Declan passed every morning without looking through, and my phone showed a number I'd kept in my contacts for 15 years without using. I let it ring twice. "Are you ready to talk?" he said. I said yes. We met 2 hours later at a coffee shop on 51st Street. Small, mid-block, no one who would recognize either of us. No restaurant, no office. Nothing that looked like a meeting. When I arrived, Callum was already there. He had ordered 2 coffees. Both were cold by the time I sat down. He didn't open with a pitch. He opened with what he knew. He'd been watching Declan since 2018, not obsessively, not with any particular agenda. but watching the way you watch something you recognize as unstable and want to understand before it becomes relevant. He'd seen the Forbes profile that year, the one that described Declan's firm as a solo reinvention of the New York brand market with a single half-sentence reference to administrative support. He'd made a note. He'd made other notes after that. "I know what you built," he said. "I knew by 2014. "Knowing didn't change anything," I said. "No," he said. "That's why I waited until you were ready." He wasn't offering to rescue me. He said that explicitly, which was why I didn't dismiss the conversation the moment it started. He was offering infrastructure, his client base, his contracts, his legal standing as a logistics firm with an established track record in the exact markets where Declan's preferred vendor network operated. What he needed from me was something I was already positioned to provide: a series of ordinary vendor recommendations made over time, by someone whose professional role made such recommendations entirely expected. I was the estate and brand manager. Recommending vendors was part of my job description. We agreed on a pace 1 or 2 clients per quarter. No pressure, no misrepresentation. Every recommendation I made would be accurate. Price Logistics was genuinely competitive in the markets where I recommended them. Every client who moved would move because they chose to based on information I presented fairly. The pattern would only be visible in aggregate, and by the time anyone looked at the aggregate, the pattern would already be complete. I started in April 2022. By the end of that year, 9 clients had made the transition. By mid-2023, 18. By September 2024, 27. Callum found me near the fireplace at 20 minutes past 9. He didn't approach me the way someone approaches a collaborator. He moved through the room the way he always moved, without announcing himself, taking the space that was available, rather than making space where there wasn't any. He stopped beside me and looked at the room. 27. He said low enough that only I could hear. "Right on schedule." I didn't look at him. I was watching Declan and Gerald Holt across the room, watching Gerald laugh at something Declan had said. "Gerald looks comfortable," I said. "He's been comfortable for about 6 months," Callum said. "He stopped thinking about the transition after the first quarter." That was how it worked when it worked correctly. Not a rupture. A redirection. Quiet enough that the person being redirected around never felt the movement, only the destination. I looked at the room one more time. 27 people who had once been anchor clients in Declan's portfolio. 27 contracts that now carried Price Logistics' name. And Declan, standing at the center of the room, still reading the space, still working the conversation, still entirely confident, he understood what he was standing in. He didn't know what Gerald's contract said. He hadn't checked. He hadn't checked because checking the detail had always been my job, and he had never considered what would happen if I stopped doing it in his interest. "Does he know yet?" Callum asked. "No," I said. "But he'll start to by morning." Callum nodded once and moved away without another word. I stayed near the fireplace and watched Declan finish his conversation with Gerald, shaking hands with the ease of a man who still believed the ground beneath him was solid. Gerald smiled back warmly, genuinely. There was no tension in it. Gerald had moved on. He'd moved on without drama or announcement because the recommendation he'd received had been accurate and the service had been better. And that was all it had taken. Of all the things I had built over the past 2 years, the transfers were the most straightforward. They required patience and consistency, nothing more. There was nothing coercive in them. Nothing illegal. Nothing that any court would look at and see as anything other than a series of reasonable, well-documented business referrals made by a qualified professional over a 2-year period. But they had cost Declan the foundation of his client portfolio without him ever noticing the erosion. The room was still warm. The fireplace was still going. And somewhere in the logistics architecture that now supported 27 of the 63 people in this house, Callum's name was on the contract. Of all the things I had prepared, though the transfers were not the most intricate piece. The most intricate piece was something else entirely, someone else entirely. A person I had not placed, A person Callum had placed for reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment. And everything to do with leverage I hadn't fully understood until the coffee cups were cold and the plan was already in motion. The most sophisticated part of what had been built in this room tonight had a face I'd first seen in a crowd 2 years ago and a resume I'd looked up the next morning. I hadn't yet decided how I felt about that. Madison Cole was standing near the north window with a glass of sparkling water, not champagne, watching the room, the way analysts watch rooms. Not looking for drama, looking for data. I had been watching her for 6 minutes before she noticed me. That was the first thing I'd registered about her back in June of 2022. When Callum brought her to meet me at a corner table in a restaurant in the Flatiron district that was quiet enough for a conversation neither of us intended to repeat. She had arrived 4 minutes early. She had ordered water. And she had spent the first 2 minutes of our introduction not speaking, only listening. With the particular quality of attention that distinguishes people who are genuinely processing from people who are merely waiting for their turn to talk. I had known within approximately 8 minutes that Callum had made a correct decision. I had seen her name once before in 2018 on Declan's phone in a message thread I had not been meant to read. At the time, I had not known who she was. I knew only a name. It took 4 more years and a conversation in a coffee shop on 51st Street before I understood what that name actually meant. She was 31 when I met her. 5 years at Goldman Sachs. The last 2 as a senior analyst on the portfolio risk team, the kind of desk that doesn't make headlines because its entire function is to ensure that the headlines never happen. She had left not because she'd failed, but because she had succeeded precisely enough to understand what success looked like from the inside of that institution, and had decided it wasn't a room she wanted to keep building. Callum had found her 3 months after she resigned. He had not approached her with a story about loyalty or legacy. He had approached her with a job description: Director of Investment Analysis, Price Logistics, Competitive Compensation, Real Authority. A portfolio of analytical work that would actually determine outcomes rather than document them after the fact. She had asked one question before accepting. What does the work require that I should know before I agree to it? Callum had told her. All of it. Does she know what she's walking into? I asked him in the restaurant after she had excused herself to take a call in the lobby. She knows exactly what she's walking into, he said. That's why I hired her. The investment analysis Madison brought to Declan was not fabricated. That was the detail I had needed to sit with when Callum first explained the structure to me, because the instinct was to assume deception required falsification. It didn't. Not in this case. The analyses were real, built on legitimate frameworks grounded in actual market data constructed with the kind of rigor that would pass review at any serious institution. Madison had written every line of them herself. They were at the moment of delivery entirely accurate representations of the investment theses they described. They also contained structural assumptions that were reasonable in the short term and quietly catastrophic across an 18 to 24-month horizon. Not errors. Assumptions the kind that a sophisticated investor who read the footnotes would question, and that a confident investor who trusted the source might not. Declan trusted the source. He trusted it because Madison had introduced herself to him at a networking event in October of 2022, not as anything other than what she was: Director of Investment Analysis, Price Logistics, former Goldman Sachs. She had a business card with accurate information on it and a LinkedIn profile that any associate could verify in 4 minutes. She had not flirted with him. She had not performed any version of availability or accessibility. She had presented a market thesis on regional logistics infrastructure that was counterintuitive, well-evidenced. And this was the part Declan could not have resisted, slightly ahead of where the conversation in his own professional circle had reached. He had asked for a follow-up meeting. She had taken 3 days to respond. The personal dimension came later, and it had not been planned. Callum told me this directly, and I believed him not because I thought him incapable of that level of engineering, but because the alternative required Madison to have performed something over the course of 2 years that no person I observed for 6 minutes in a restaurant could have been acting. What developed between her and Declan was a consequence of proximity and the particular vulnerability that surfaces in people who believe they are the smartest person in a room, the hunger for someone who confirms that belief by appearing to match it. Declan had walked toward her himself. No one had pushed him. In some ways, that made it more complete than anything we could have arranged. Across the room, she caught my eye. It was brief, less than 2 seconds, not long enough for anyone nearby to notice an exchange had occurred. She gave a small nod. Not a smile. Not acknowledgement in any form that could be read as warmth or conspiracy. Just a clean signal between two people who understood a shared context without requiring it to be narrated. I returned it. She looked away first, back toward Declan, who was standing approximately 4 feet from her, and speaking with the ease of a man who believed he was in the company of someone who admired him. He was relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him be at this party before tonight. Shoulders down, the particular openness that comes when a person feels genuinely seen by the person in front of them. Madison was nodding at something he said. Her expression was attentive. She knew more about Declan Vance's financial exposure than his own legal team did. She had built the models. She understood in precise numerical terms what the next quarter would surface when the positions he had taken on her analysis began to resolve. She had probably known for 6 months what the outcome would be. She had continued the conversation anyway, not because she was cruel, but because the conversation, like the analysis, had its own internal logic, and that logic required it to run to completion. I watched him laugh at something. I watched her smile at the right moment. Of all the things I understood about Declan Vance tonight, the heaviest did not come from Madison. It did not come from the financial models or the 27 transferred contracts, or the $100 million check that Callum had placed on a table in front of 40 witnesses 3 hours ago. It came from a single document I had found on a November evening in 2019. Not a message, not a photograph, not the kind of thing that confirms what you already suspect and gives you permission to be angry. A receipt. Old paper folded twice in the back of a drawer I had organized myself, and therefore had every reason to open. I hadn't told Callum about it. I hadn't told anyone. Some things you carry alone, not because you're protecting someone, but because the weight of them is the only thing keeping you from moving too fast before the time is right. Tonight, the time was right. Before I reveal the all-changing details about who actually owns this house, drop a mine in the comments right now so I know you're still with me. Because what happens next? Declan never saw it coming either. A small note: some elements in the story ahead are fictional, included purely for entertainment and educational purposes. If this isn't the content for you, it's completely okay to step away here. It was close to 10 o'clock when Helen Marsh found me near the staircase. She didn't say anything. She held out her phone with a single message on the screen, waited for me to read it, and then took it back. Confirmation of transfer received. Holloway Family Trust recorded as sole owner of title, clean and final. I handed the phone back. Helen turned and walked away without a word. That was the language we had developed over 4 years of working together, the language of people who have been through enough that explanation becomes a kind of noise. She knew what the message meant. I knew what it meant. Nothing else needed to be said about it tonight. I stood at the foot of the staircase and looked up at the ceiling above the main hall. The chandelier was Venetian hand-blown glass sourced from a small workshop outside Murano that didn't take commissions from retail buyers. I had spent 11 weeks corresponding with the workshop through an interpreter before they agreed to produce it. Declan had seen it installed and said it was fine. He had not asked what it cost, or where it came from, or who had arranged for it to be shipped across the Atlantic in a crate, lined with foam cut to specifications I had provided. He had never asked about any of it. That was in the end the fact on which everything else rested. In the spring of 2022, Declan was in the middle of a commercial development deal in Miami that required the kind of sustained attention that left no room for anything else. He had been in Florida for most of March and all of April. The Hamptons property had come to him through a contact, a private listing, no public record. The kind of transaction that moves quickly or not at all. He wanted it. He didn't want to manage the paperwork. Just handle it, Sarah, he said over the phone from what I could tell was a hotel lobby. That's what you do. He signed the power of attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in a document that had been prepared by Helen's office and sent to him digitally. It was 4 pages. He had been managing documents at that volume for long enough that 4 pages no longer registered as something that required reading. He initialed each page and returned it within the hour. Helen had drafted the language herself. She had spent 2 weeks on it, not because the concept was complicated, but because the specificity of the authorization required precision. A broad POA is not unusual in real estate transactions, particularly when a principal is managing multiple active deals across jurisdictions. What matters is scope. Under New York law, a properly executed POA can authorize an agent to engage in real property transactions on the principal's behalf, including the structuring of acquisition through a trust vehicle, provided the language of the authorization is sufficient to encompass that structure. Helen's language was sufficient. She had made certain of it. The Holloway Family Trust was established in March of 2022, 6 weeks before the property closed. The name came from my father's side of the family, his mother's maiden name, carried through a line that had nothing to do with Vance, or with Declan, or with any of the professional history we had built together. I chose it deliberately. Not as concealment, the trust was a registered legal entity fully documented with the state, with Helen as trustee of record and complete paperwork establishing its formation. Nothing about it was hidden from anyone who thought to look. Declan did not look. He received a closing summary after the transaction completed, a 2-page document that listed the property address, the purchase price, the date of closing, and the entity through which title had been recorded. The Holloway Family Trust was named on page 1. He had signed the acknowledgement of receipt without calling to ask what it meant. I know this because Helen kept the signed acknowledgement. She keeps everything. The question, if Declan ever reached the point of asking it, would not be whether the transaction had occurred. It had occurred. Title was recorded. Documentation was complete. And every step had been executed in accordance with the authorization he had signed. The question would be whether the POA he had granted covered the specific structure that had been used, and on that question, Helen had spent considerably more time than Declan had spent reading the document. To successfully argue that I had exceeded the scope of the authorization, he would need to demonstrate that the language of the POA did not include the power to structure acquisition through a trust vehicle. Helen's drafting addressed that possibility with the kind of thoroughness that does not leave gaps for that argument to occupy. He had signed it himself. He had been given the opportunity to read it. He had chosen not to. That was not a choice I had made for him. I stood under the chandelier and looked at the room the way I had looked at it 100 times in the 2 years since we had taken possession, running through the inventory of decisions that had accumulated into this space. The floors, the lighting placement, the proportions of the furniture relative to the ceiling height, the sight lines from the main entrance to the garden doors. Every choice in this room was mine. The name on the title was mine. Declan had stood at the center of this space tonight and used it as a stage, used the guests I had invited, the atmosphere I had constructed, the credibility this address carried in every room where it was mentioned to make a performance of diminishing me. He had put a number on what I was worth. In front of 40 witnesses who remained in the main room, the others had moved to the terrace and the outdoor bar beyond the reach of Bryce Harlow's camera in a house he did not own. I had let him do it because the sequence required it, because certain things need to be witnessed before they can be understood. Now across the room, I could see him moving in my direction. The expression on his face was the one I had known for 16 years, relaxed, certain, the face of a man who has never had a reason to question whether the ground beneath him is solid. He moved through his own party with the ease of ownership. He believed this room was his. He had believed it for 2 years without ever checking whether the belief was accurate. I watched him approach and did not move toward him. There is a specific kind of reckoning that cannot be rushed, and cannot be softened, and cannot be experienced secondhand. It has to arrive in real time in a real room, with no distance between the person delivering it and the person receiving it. He was close enough now that I could see him clearly. I let him come. Declan found me before I found him. That was unusual. Ordinarily, I was the one who navigated toward him, managing the distance, managing the proximity, managing everything in between. He came from the direction of the East Corridor, moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who has decided something and is now executing on that decision before he can reconsider it. The main room had thinned considerably, perhaps 30 guests remaining clustered near the bar, and the fireplace, the density of conversation lower, now the edges of the evening beginning to show. He steered me toward the small sitting room off the north hallway without asking whether I wanted to go there. I went, because the sequence required it and because I had been waiting for this conversation since approximately 8:45. When I first noticed him recalibrating the way he looked at me from across the room. The sitting room was empty. He closed the door behind us, not all the way, but enough to reduce the ambient noise to something manageable. A floor lamp in the corner threw a narrow circle of light. Outside the window, the garden lights were still on, and I could see the shapes of a few guests who had stepped out for air. He didn't begin immediately. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at me in the way he had always looked at me when he was assembling something, reading the variables, calculating the distance between what he knew and what he needed to know. "How do you know Callum Price?" he said. "He knew my father." I said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." He shifted his weight, a small movement, but I had known him long enough to recognize it. It was the movement he made when a conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned, and he was deciding whether to press forward or redirect. "Nobody writes $100 million check at a dinner party, Sarah." "Callum Price does," I said. He redirected. That was his pattern when a line of inquiry produced something he couldn't immediately categorize. He abandoned it temporarily and attacked from a different angle. I had watched him do it in negotiations for 16 years. He was good at it. He was good at most things that required reading a room and adjusting in real time. He was less good at reading me, because I had spent 16 years making sure of it. "You made me look like I didn't know what was happening in my own house," he said. The register of his voice had dropped controlled, the way he got when he was genuinely irritated rather than performing irritation. "In front of people who matter. That's not what tonight was supposed to be." I didn't say anything. "You don't understand how these events function," he said. "What that looked like to the people in that room? I understand exactly how these events function," I said. "I designed this one." He stopped. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In the context of the conversation we were having, 4 seconds was a significant interval. "The check," he said. "Is it real?" "You'll know by morning." He studied me. This was the part I had anticipated most precisely, not the anger which was predictable, and not the redirect which was habitual, but this. The moment when he tried to locate something familiar in my face and found that the coordinates had changed. I watched him search for the version of me he knew how to manage, and I watched him not find it. It wasn't that I had become someone different. It was that I had stopped performing the version he had come to rely on, and the absence of the performance was more disorienting to him than any confrontation could have been. "You knew he was coming," he said. It wasn't a question. He had arrived at it the way he arrived at most things, through elimination rather than intuition, ruling out the alternatives until only one remained. Callum Price did not appear at private dinners without an invitation. Invitations came from the host. The host was me. I looked at him. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I simply held the space of the question without filling it, which was its own kind of answer, and which he understood. Because he was not a man who needed things explained to him when the explanation was already visible. What he didn't understand, what he had no framework yet for understanding, was the scope of what that acknowledgement implied. He thought he was looking at an act of defiance, a response to the evening's provocation. A woman who had called in a favor from an old family connection to restore some balance after a public humiliation. He wasn't wrong about the surface of it. He was wrong about everything beneath. He started to say something I could see it forming the particular set of his jaw that preceded the kind of statement he intended to be final. He had a gift for those statements. He had used them on me for 16 years, and for most of those years they had landed the way he intended them to. "You should have thought about what I am," I said, "before you put a price on it in front of 63 people and a live camera, Declan." I said it quietly. I did not raise my voice. There was nothing in my tone that could be described as heated or accusatory or even particularly emphatic. It was simply the sentence, delivered at a volume appropriate to the size of the room, and then I moved toward the door. "Sirrah." I opened it and walked back into the hallway. The ambient sound of the party returned low music, the tail end of conversations, the sound of glasses being collected by the catering staff. I walked toward the main room without increasing my pace. Behind me, I heard him say my name once more. I did not turn around. The hard part of tonight was over. That was what I told myself standing at the edge of the main room watching the last clusters of guests say their goodbyes near the entrance. The chandelier above the hall was still lit. The garden lights were still on. The house looked the way it had looked at 9 o'clock and at 8 o'clock. And at 7, when the first guests had arrived, composed certain exactly as intended. But I was not thinking about the house. I was thinking about a November evening in 2019 and a drawer I had opened without expecting to find anything in it, and the thing I had found that had changed the shape of every year that followed. Not the contracts, not the trust, not the 27 transferred clients or the investment analyses with their carefully structured horizons. Something older than all of it. Something that had been sitting in the back of that drawer folded twice. For years before I found it waiting with the patience of a thing that does not need to announce itself because it is simply irrevocably true. I had carried it alone. I had not told Callum. I had not told Helen. Some weight you carry alone, not because you are protecting someone else, but because setting it down before the right moment would change the nature of everything that follows. The moment was almost here. The last guest left just after 11. By midnight, the catering crew had cleared the main floor glasses, collected surfaces, wiped the furniture, returned to the arrangements I had specified in the setup notes I'd sent 3 weeks ago. The florist's team had already taken the larger arrangements. What remained were the smaller ones, the ones I had placed on the side tables and the windowsills. And they would stay until morning because removing them at midnight would have felt like dismantling something that hadn't finished being what it was. The house settled into the kind of silence that only large, expensive houses produce, not the absence of sound, but its amplification. A clock, somewhere in the east wing. The refrigeration unit in the wine room cycling on. My own footsteps on the hardwood floor of the upstairs corridor as I walked toward the office at the end of the hall. I closed the door behind me. I did not turn on the overhead light. The desk lamp was enough. The safe was built into the wall behind the bookcase, not hidden exactly, but not visible unless you knew to move the third panel from the left. I had specified its installation during the renovation in a line item on the contractor's invoice that read, "Recessed wall unit, north office, custom dimensions." Declan had seen the invoice. He had not asked about it. The combination was 8 digits. I had chosen them myself and written them nowhere. I opened it and stood looking at what was inside for a moment before I touched anything. 14 years of documents organized chronologically in labeled folders. Each one fitted into the space with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what order they would need to be accessed in and under what circumstances. The earliest folder was dated 2010. The most recent had been updated 6 weeks ago. I took out the accordion file that sat behind the folders, heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that comes from paper rather than from any single object. I carried it to the desk and set it down without opening it. I already knew what was inside. I had read every page more times than was strictly necessary, which was its own kind of preparation, the way you rehearse a conversation you know is coming, until the words stop feeling like words and start feeling simply like the truth. The role of estate manager in its fullest expression means knowing everything. Not the curated version of everything that a principal chooses to share with their accountant, or their attorney, or their financial advisor in a given quarter. The actual everything, the income that moved through the structures. I managed the expenses that were categorized in ways that required judgment calls. The gap between what the business reported to its partners and what it reported to the federal government, and the degree to which that gap had been maintained, adjusted, and managed over the course of nearly a decade. I had not gone looking for it. That was the detail I returned to most often in the years since 2019, when I had finally allowed myself to understand what I had been seeing incrementally for years. I had not audited Declan's tax filings with the intention of finding something. I had simply been doing my job, managing the documentation, maintaining the records, ensuring that the administrative architecture of our shared professional life remained functional, and the picture had assembled itself from the materials already in my possession. It was not a single decision. It was never a single decision with Declan. It was a series of small ones, each one defensible in isolation. Each one adding a layer to a structure that became harder to examine the more complete it became. A consulting arrangement that produced no deliverables. A depreciation schedule applied to an asset that no longer existed. Revenue that moved through an LLC with a single member and a mailing address in Delaware, and emerged on the other side categorized in a way that reduced its taxable character. None of it was visible from any single document. The pattern only emerged when you held all the documents at once and looked at what they added up to across a sustained period. I had been holding all the documents for 14 years. I had understood what they added up to for 5. Helen had reviewed the complete file in January of this year. She had spent 4 days on it, working at a table in her office with the door closed, and at the end of those 4 days she had called me and spoken for 11 minutes. She did not express surprise. Helen was not easily surprised by what people concealed when they believed no one was paying attention. What she expressed was the specific kind of precision that comes from an attorney who has assessed a situation fully and is now communicating its parameters. There were 2 frameworks available, she said. The first involved a structured voluntary disclosure process, a path that existed precisely because the system recognized that people sometimes arrived at compliance late and provided a mechanism for doing so in a way that reduced exposure. It was not amnesty, but it was substantially preferable for everyone involved to the alternative. The second framework did not require Declan's cooperation to initiate. Helen had prepared documentation for both. She had filed nothing. She was waiting as I was waiting for the conversation that had not yet happened, but that was now, as of tonight, no longer something that could be deferred. I looked at the red folder sitting on top of the accordion file. It was labeled simply with a year 2019 and a single letter beneath it that I had written myself in the kind of shorthand that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been present for the specific conversation it referenced. I did not open it. I had not opened it tonight because I had not needed to. The contents were as familiar to me as anything I had ever memorized, more familiar in some ways, because I had returned to them not out of choice, but out of the particular compulsion that comes from carrying something alone and needing to verify periodically that you have remembered it correctly. I had remembered it correctly every time. I did not need Declan to be destroyed. That framing had never been accurate, and the evenings I had spent in this office over the past 2 years had not been spent in the service of destruction. They had been spent in the service of documentation, of preparation, of ensuring that when the moment came, the ground I was standing on was solid, and the ground beneath him was exactly as unstable as it had become through his own choices over his own years without any assistance from me. He had built this. I had simply kept the records. I closed the safe and listened to the lock engage a single clean sound in the amplified silence of the house. Tomorrow I would give him two choices. He would not like either of them, but one of them would be survivable, and I had no investment in which one he selected as long as he selected one before the window closed. But tomorrow was not yet here. There was one thing remaining, something I had been putting off with the specific patience of someone who knows that a task exists and knows that it cannot be completed until the time around it is right. The time was right now. It had become right sometime in the last hour in the sitting room off the north hallway, when I had watched Declan try to find me in my own face and come back empty. I turned off the desk lamp. The office went dark except for the garden lights coming through the window, soft, low, the kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as suggest. I sat for a moment in that light before I moved. I was awake before 5, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that for the first time in more years than I could accurately count, I had not woken up to begin preparing someone else's day. No schedule to review, no calls to anticipate, no mental inventory of what Declan would need between 7 and 9, and what would happen if any of it wasn't in place. I lay still for approximately 90 seconds, registering the absence of that wait, and then I got up and went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen was the way I had left it at midnight, clean. The catering crew had seen to that. The surfaces clear except for the fruit bowl I kept on the island counter and the small stack of mail that had accumulated since Thursday. Outside the window above the sink, the garden was still in the gray pre-dawn light, the string lights from last night still threaded through the hedges not yet switched off. I filled the kettle. I ground the beans. I did these things at the pace of someone who had nowhere to be and no one to report to, which was a pace I was still learning. My phone was face down on the counter where I had left it. I turned it over at 5:04 a.m. The notification count was not something I had seen on my personal phone before. Not at that volume, not on a Saturday morning before the sun had fully risen. I opened the most recent first, which was a mistake in the sense that it established a ceiling I then spent the next 40 minutes watching everything else climb toward. The clip was 53 seconds long. Bryce Harlow had not posted the full live stream. He had done something more precise. He had identified the 53 seconds that contained maximum velocity and clipped it cleanly, with no introduction and no context beginning mid-sentence from Declan and ending on the silence that followed. The silence was the part that had traveled. You could see in those last 8 seconds the specific quality of a room understanding something before the people at the center of it did. At 5 a.m., the clip had 1.8 million views on a single platform. The comments were not what I spent time reading. I had anticipated the general shape of public response, the outrage accounts. The takes, the quote posts from people who had never heard of Declan Vance 12 hours ago and now had strong opinions about his character. What I had not anticipated or had anticipated differently was the speed. By 5:30, the clip had been picked up by 4 media aggregator accounts with combined followings in the tens of millions. By 5:45, hashtag Declan Vance was registering on the trending sidebar of 2 major platforms, not because anyone had organized it, but because the algorithm rewards content that generates simultaneous engagement across opposing positions, and this clip was generating both. I drank my coffee and read the numbers the way I had been trained to read financial data without editorializing, without projecting, simply recording what was there. The first email arrived at 6:12 a.m. It came from the brand partnerships division of a luxury goods company whose name I recognized because I had negotiated the contract myself 14 months ago. The email was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph contained language about brand alignment and values consistency that had clearly been drafted by a legal team rather than a communications team. The second paragraph confirmed termination of the endorsement agreement effective immediately. With reference to a morality clause, that I had read carefully when I had reviewed the contract and had noted at the time as unusually broad in its application. The contract was worth $400,000 annually. It had 18 months remaining. I set my phone down, refilled my coffee, and stood at the window watching the garden lighten for approximately 3 minutes. Then I picked the phone back up. The second email had arrived at 6:47 a.m., a different brand sportswear, a collaboration that had been announced publicly in April and had generated the kind of press that Declan's team had circulated extensively. Termination. Morality clause. Effective immediately. The third arrived at 7:23 a.m. This one, I had not anticipated a financial services firm that had engaged Declan as a keynote speaker for a series of events running through the first quarter of 2025. The language was more careful than the first two, couched in terms of scheduling conflicts and programming adjustments, but the outcome was identical. I wrote down the total on the small notepad I kept in the kitchen drawer, the one I used for grocery lists and contractor follow-ups. I wrote the number clearly and looked at it for a moment, then closed the notepad. There was one other message I had not yet mentioned, sent at 5:58 a.m. from Helen, 3 words: funds confirmed. Cleared. The check Callum had placed on the console table the previous evening had been drawn on a verified account. I had known it would be. Callum Price did not make gestures. He made transactions. Declan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:04 a.m. He was still in what he had been wearing when I'd last seen him the night before. Not the jacket, but the shirt untucked now, the collar open. His hair was not combed. He was holding his phone in a way that suggested he had been holding it for some time, the grip too tight for something he intended to put down. He looked at me across the kitchen island. "What did you do?" he said. "I'm drinking coffee," I said. I did not look up from my cup. He crossed the room and placed his phone on the island between us, screen facing up. The display showed an email notification. The sender line read Forbes Digital, and the subject line was visible in the preview: request for comment deadline, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. I looked at it for a moment. Declan had wanted Forbes to write about him since 2015. I knew this because he had mentioned it over the years, in the particular way that people mention things they want, without wanting to appear to want them. Oblique, repeated, framed each time as an observation about the publication rather than a desire for its attention. He had mentioned it to journalists at other outlets, to partners at dinners, to me during the kind of late evenings when the performance of confidence had relaxed enough to let something more honest through. He was going to get his Forbes story. "This is your fault," he said. "Bryce Harlow posted a clip of something that happened." I said. "I didn't post it." "You invited him." "You put a price on me in front of his camera," I said. "Those are different sentences." He picked up his phone. He stood at the island for another moment, not speaking, the way he stood when he was calculating something and hadn't arrived at the number yet. Then he turned and walked back toward the hallway. The door to his office closed with the kind of force that is not quite a slam, but is not anything else either. The kitchen was quiet again. I finished my coffee standing at the counter, looking at the garden where the string lights were still on, small and unnecessary now in the morning light, still doing the job they'd been given even though the occasion for them had passed. I thought about November 2019. Not the document. I had thought about the document enough times that it had become almost abstract, a known quantity rather than a revelation. I thought about the specific evening, the drawer, the moment before I understood what I was looking at, and the moment after, and the promise I had made to myself in the space between those two moments, that when the time came, I would not pretend. I would not manage it into something comfortable. I would not find a version of the truth that was easier to present because it was easier to receive. I would not, after everything, perform the same disappearing act I had been performing for 16 years, absorbing the difficult thing, smoothing it over, making it possible for someone else to continue without interruption. The time had arrived on the schedule I had set for it. This morning was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the part that could not be taken back. Declan's voice through the closed door sounded controlled, but strained the specific register of a man accustomed to managing other people's crises who has suddenly found himself managing his own. I remained at the kitchen table. There are memories that don't require silence to surface. They have always been there, waiting with the patience of something that knows it will eventually be attended to. I hadn't wanted children immediately. That was the truth I returned to first because it mattered to the shape of everything that followed. In the early years of the marriage, Declan and I had agreed, genuinely agreed, not in the way where one person concedes and calls it agreement that the timing wasn't right. We were building something. The business required the kind of attention that doesn't leave room for other kinds of attention, and I understood that. And I had accepted it without resentment, because I believed we were building towards something we would eventually share. By 2015, I was 27. The belief had not changed, but something underneath it had shifted quietly without announcement the way most significant internal changes occur. I began to want it in a way that was no longer theoretical. "We're at a critical growth stage," Declan said when I raised it. "Not now." I accepted this. I wrote it into the same category as the other deferrals, the vacation we hadn't taken, the apartment in the city we had discussed, and set aside. The smaller things that accumulate into the shape of a life deferred. I was good at deferral. I had been practicing it for years. In 2017, I went to a doctor alone. The results were normal, entirely, unremarkably normal. The physician asked about my husband, in the careful way that physicians ask about partners when a couple has been trying for some time. I said he hadn't come in yet. She nodded and said it was worth having him assessed, that these things were rarely one-sided. I relayed this to Declan. "I don't need a doctor to tell me I'm fine," he said. He wasn't angry when he said it, just certain in the way he was certain about most things that he had already decided. I did not push. Pushing required a kind of sustained confrontation that I had learned by then to navigate around rather than through. We stopped discussing it explicitly after that. The subject became one of the things that existed between us in the form of its own absence present, precisely because it was never named. In November of 2019, I was processing the annual renewal of our health insurance coverage. This was a task I had handled every year since 2012, reviewing the policy terms, updating the documentation, cross-referencing the claims history to ensure the coverage remained appropriate for our actual usage. It was administrative work, the kind that requires attention rather than thought. And I had developed a system for it that moved efficiently through the records without requiring me to engage with each line item individually. I engaged with one line item. It appeared in the archived claims from 2011, the first year of our marriage, before I had fully integrated the insurance management into my own systems. When the records still carried the organizational logic of whoever had managed them before me. An outpatient procedure code. No narrative description. Billed to a clinic whose name I recognized as being in the neighborhood near the hotel in Boston, where Declan had stayed during a week he had described at the time as a conference. I remembered that week. I remembered it because it was the same week I had started a new medication that my own physician had recommended, something to support what she had described, with careful optimism as our plans going forward. I did not ask Declan about the code. I found a private investigator through a referral I traced through 3 intermediaries, which took 4 days. His fee for 3 weeks of verification work was $4,200. I paid it in cash, from an account that existed in my name alone. He confirmed it in writing on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2019. The procedure had been performed in April 2011. I sat at the kitchen table of our apartment in the city. Not this house, we hadn't bought this house yet, and held the investigator's report for a long time without reading it again. I had already read it twice. I understood what it said. What I was doing was something different from reading something closer to the process of integrating a fact that changes the meaning of a significant number of other facts, reaching backward through time and reclassifying them one by one. The medication I had taken in 2011. The appointments in 2015, 2016, the tentative optimism of those years. The doctor's office in 2017, and the question about my husband and the answer I had given. The years of quiet, of deferral, of writing things into the category of not yet, rather than never. Not yet had always been a lie. I understood that now with the specific completeness of someone who has been handed the last piece of a puzzle they had been assembling without knowing it was a puzzle. What I felt first was not anger. Anger would have required a kind of heat I didn't have access to in that moment. What came first was a stillness, the particular quality of stillness that follows the removal of something you had been holding without realizing you were holding it. The hope, specifically. The version of the future I had continued to maintain in some part of my thinking, even as other parts of the marriage had begun to clarify themselves. That version did not survive November 2019. The anger came later. It came in the weeks that followed, arriving in increments, which was almost worse than if it had arrived all at once, because incremental anger is harder to set down. Of everything Declan had done and not done, this was the thing I could not place in a drawer and close. Not the money, not the credit he had taken, not Madison, not the professional erasure, not any of the things I had documented and filed and built a legal architecture around. Those things had answers, structural, procedural, resolvable through the mechanisms that exist precisely for that purpose. This had no mechanism. He had made a decision in the first year of our marriage, and he had carried it in silence through every conversation we had ever had about the future. Through every year I had continued to believe in a version of us that he had already foreclosed. He had let me hope. He had watched me hope. And he had said nothing. That was the thing I had been carrying since November 2019. Not in the files, not in the safe. Nowhere that could be documented or filed or converted into leverage. Just in the body, the way certain things are carried. Declan's voice continued from the room across the hall, still controlled, still managing, still performing competence for an audience on the other end of a phone line. I stood up. I rinsed my cup. I placed it face down on the drying rack. I was not going to pretend for another second of this day. Callum arrived at 10 o'clock exactly when he had said he would. He came through the front entrance rather than the side door that most people used when arriving informally, which told me he had thought about what this visit was and had decided it warranted the formal approach. He was carrying 2 cups from a bakery 2 miles down the road, the kind of place that has been in the same location for 30 years and does not have a social media presence and is not in any publication's guide to anything. My father had stopped there on Sunday mornings when I was young enough that Sunday mornings still had a particular quality to them. I had not been inside since his funeral. I didn't ask Callum how he had found it. Some things you accept without tracing them back to their source. Declan was in the office at the end of the east corridor behind a closed door. On what I estimated was his 3rd consecutive call of the morning, based on the intervals of silence between the stretches of controlled, audible tension that had been moving through the house since 8:30. The PR team, I assumed. Possibly legal. Possibly both, simultaneously. Which was the kind of morning that produces a specific brand of exhaustion, the kind that arrives, not from effort but from the sustained performance of confidence, in the absence of any actual ground to stand on. I led Callum to the sitting room off the main hallway. The garden was visible through the north window. The string lights from the previous evening had finally been switched off, and in the full morning light, the garden looked like what it was well maintained, deliberately composed the work of someone who understood how spaces communicate before anyone enters them. We sat. He placed 1 cup in front of me without asking how I took it. He already knew. He didn't move directly to the point. That was one of the things I had understood about Callum Price. Across the years of knowing him, he did not treat efficiency and care as synonymous. He looked at me across the low table in the way that people look when they are actually asking the question, rather than performing the act of asking it. "How are you?" he said. "I've been preparing for this for 2 years. I said. I'm all right. He nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was. Not a deflection, not a performance of composure. Simply an accurate report from someone who had done the preparation and was now standing at the point where preparation ends and execution begins. He did not tell me I was strong or brave, or any of the other words that people reach for when they want to acknowledge difficulty without sitting inside it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a thin document folder on the table between us. Take your time, he said. The cover page was a single-sheet corporate structure overview, Price Logistics Group, the new division outlined in a clean organizational diagram. The expansion into commercial real estate and asset management had been in development since 2021. He explained, not rushed, not reactive. Built from the recognition that the market was moving in a direction that rewarded firms with genuine cross-sector expertise and the relational infrastructure to execute across both domains. What the division needed was not a figurehead. It needed someone who understood the financial architecture of high-value asset portfolios, who had a functional network across the New York market at the level where decisions were actually made, and who carried enough professional credibility to build a new brand identity without requiring the new identity to lean on an existing one for legitimacy. I built this position for you starting in 2022, Sarah Callum said. The title has belonged to you the entire time. I was waiting for the moment you were ready to take it. I looked at him steadily. This isn't about gratitude anymore, is it? It stopped being about gratitude a long time ago. He set his cup down. You handed me a blueprint in 2007 when you were 19 years old and had just buried your father. I watched you work for 14 years after that. This is about what you're actually capable of, which is considerably more than what you've been permitted to do. There was nothing in his voice that required a response, which was precisely why it required one. You've been watching me work for Declan, I said. I've been watching you work, he said. The name on the contract was incidental. I turned to the second page. The title read, Chief Executive Officer Vance Price Asset Group. My name was listed in the first position on the organizational chart, above the divisional directors, above the advisory board, at the top of the structure in the way that names appear when they are not decorative, but functional. The compensation structure was on page 3, and I read it with the same attention I would give any document of consequence. Because the figure was serious, and the equity provision was serious, and the whole thing had been constructed with the seriousness of something that had been thought through, rather than assembled quickly to meet a moment. I looked up. Vance Price, I said. Why? Callum held my gaze without any of the performance that question might have invited from a different person. Because you built half of what made the Vance name worth anything in the first place, he said. It belongs in the title. I looked at the page again. My name at the top of the chart above a structure I had not built, but that had been built specifically around the shape of what I could do, the knowledge, the network, the 14 years of executed work that had existed under a name that was not mine and had produced value that had never been credited to its actual source. Vance Price. My name first. It was a small thing to look at. A compound word, 2 syllables each arranged in order of precedence. It was also not a small thing at all. And Callum understood that, which was why he had said only what needed to be said about it, and then left it there on the table between us for me to look at. I had not signed anything. Not because I was uncertain. I had not been uncertain about this since approximately January of this year, when the shape of how the next 12 months would move had become clear enough to plan against. The document on the table was not a surprise to me. The terms were not a surprise. My own response was not a surprise. What remained was sequence. There was one thing that had to happen before I put my name on anything, and it had to happen in the right order, and the right order required Declan to be present for it. From the corridor, I heard the sound of a door opening. Declan came around the corner from the east hallway and stopped when he saw us. He had changed from this morning's clothes into something more deliberate, jacket collar closed. The external presentation of a man who had decided that looking composed was the next available form of control. But his face gave the morning away. There was a specific kind of exhaustion that PR crises produce in people who have never had to manage one involving themselves. And it was sitting in the set of his jaw and the particular flatness behind his eyes. The calls had not gone well. Good. Because what was going to happen next required him exactly as he was tired, disoriented, stripped of the easy confidence that had carried him through 16 years of never having to reckon with the full weight of anything. I did not stand up. I looked at him from where I was sitting and waited. I asked Callum to wait in the sitting room. Then I walked to my office, opened the safe, and took out 2 folders. I had rehearsed this moment many times, not the words, but the stillness. The capacity to sit across from a person you had once loved and speak with complete clarity, without performing coldness and without allowing warmth to become imprecision. The words had never needed rehearsing. I had known what I was going to say for approximately 4 years. What required practice was the quality of presence the moment demanded, the ability to remain in it without flinching and without embellishment. I placed both folders on the desk. I opened my laptop. I sat down. Helen's face was already on the screen when Declan came through the door. He stopped just inside the threshold. His eyes moved from the laptop to the open safe, to the 2 folders on the desk surface, taking inventory the way he always took inventory of a room, reading the variables before committing to an interpretation. I watched him do it. I had watched him do it in boardrooms and at dinner tables and in hotel lobbies for 16 years. And I knew the precise interval between the intake of information and the moment he decided what posture to adopt in response. "Sit down, Declan," I said. He sat. Not immediately. There was a beat of hesitation, the instinct to remain standing, asserting itself briefly before something else overrode it. He pulled the chair across from the desk and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man who is performing composure because the alternative is to admit he doesn't have it. On the laptop screen, Helen gave a single nod. She didn't speak. Her role this morning was not to speak. I opened the first folder and turned it to face him. "This is the divorce filing," I said. "Asset distribution is structured through the Holloway Family Trust, which holds title to this property and 3 other assets acquired during the marriage. The settlement provides you with a lump sum sufficient to establish yourself independently. The figure is on page 4. Helen has reviewed the terms. They are fair." He looked at the document without touching it. "The second folder contains financial documentation spanning 9 years," I said. "It also contains a voluntary disclosure package that Helen has prepared on your behalf, a submission to the IRS that initiates the formal process of correcting the underreporting that occurred across that period. If you sign the divorce settlement, Helen will file the voluntary disclosure in your name. You'll pay penalties. The amount is significant, but calculable. And the program exists precisely to allow people to come into compliance without criminal exposure." I paused. "If you don't sign," I said, "I won't file it. But I'm no longer your wife, and I'm no longer the person who manages your documentation. And I can't guarantee that the people who have held their silence as a professional courtesy extended to this marriage will continue to do so once the marriage is formally over. That's not a threat. It's a change in circumstances. The accountant who prepared the filings has his own obligations, and those obligations were never contingent on mine." The room was quiet. Declan looked at the first folder, then the second, then at the laptop screen where Helen was waiting with the particular stillness of someone who has said everything she needed to say before the meeting began. "You're bluffing," he said. His voice was steady. I gave him credit for that. I turned the laptop slightly so that the second screen was visible, the one running the draft email addressed to the IRS Examination Division. The body of the message populated with document reference numbers and a summary of the disclosed discrepancies. Next to that window was a message thread. The most recent entry timestamped the previous afternoon from an email address Declan would recognize. He read it. I watched him read it. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the ones that had preceded it. Not the silence of calculation. Declan calculating silences had a particular texture to them, a kind of pressurized quiet that you could feel as an active thing. This was something else. This was the silence of a man who has been reading a map for 16 years and has just understood, for the first time, that the territory it described was never the territory he was standing in. He looked at the open safe. He looked at the two folders. He looked at me. "You built all of this," he said. It wasn't a question. I had been prepared for many things Declan might say in this moment: anger, negotiation, the particular variety of charm he deployed when other approaches had failed. I had not fully prepared for the absence of all of those things, for the stripped-down register of what remained when none of the available performances were available to him. His voice was different. The calculation was gone from it. What was left was simpler and older, the sound of recognition arriving in a person who has been avoiding it for a long time. "You actually built all of it," he said again. "Sign the papers, Declan," I said. He looked at the pen I had placed beside the first folder. The morning light came through the office window at the angle it always came through at this hour, falling across the left side of the desk, across the edge of the folder, across the line designated for his signature on page 7 of the settlement document. I had not chosen the time of this meeting for that reason, but I noted it. He picked up the pen. He held it for a moment that extended past the time required simply to position it for signing, which told me what I had already known, that there was something he intended to say before he put his name on anything. Declan had always needed the last word, not as an act of aggression, but as a form of orientation. Without it, the ground beneath a decision felt insufficiently solid to him. I had been waiting for this for 4 years. I knew exactly what he was going to say, because I knew Declan Vance the way you know, a place you have lived in long enough to navigate it in complete darkness, not because you love it, but because you have paid attention. And I had already prepared my answer. Time in that office moved the way it does when something is coming to its end, both slower and faster than normal, as though the room itself was trying to hold the moment a few seconds longer than anyone in it wanted. Declan set the pen down. Not away from him, just down parallel to the edge of the folder, in the deliberate way he set things down when he was buying himself the interval between one thought and the next. I waited. I had been waiting for various versions of this moment for 4 years, and another 30 seconds was not a cost I couldn't absorb. He looked at me. "Tell me one thing," he said. "When did you stop?" I understood the question. Not when did you stop loving me. That question would have required a kind of vanity that Declan at this particular moment had been stripped of. He was asking something more specific and more honest. When did the fundamental orientation change? When did I become someone he was managing rather than someone he was with? "November 2019, I said. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. I counted them without meaning to. "The medical file," he said. "Yes. How long did it take you to confirm it?" 3 weeks. He looked down at the surface of the desk. The morning light was still coming through the window at its low angle, falling across the edge of the folder, across his hands, across the pen he had set down. He looked at none of these things specifically. He looked at the general surface of the desk the way people look at something neutral when they need a place to put their eyes while they are thinking something they are not yet prepared to say. "I didn't think you wanted," he began. "Don't." I said it without raising my voice, without heat, without any of the things that word can carry when it is deployed as a weapon. It was simply a full stop. "Don't tell me what you thought I wanted. You made a decision without asking me. That is the only thing I need you to understand before you sign." He didn't argue. That was the thing I had not fully anticipated, not the argument itself, which I had prepared for, but its absence. I had built contingencies for anger, for negotiation, for the particular variety of persuasion Declan used when he needed to reframe a situation in his favor. I had not built a contingency for the moment when he simply had nothing left to put forward. because everything he might have said had already been accounted for, weighed and found insufficient by the years I had spent sitting with the reality of what he had done. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady. Declan Vance did not allow people to see him unsteady. It was one of the most consistent things about him. A discipline so deeply habituated that I suspected it had long since stopped being a choice and become simply the way his body understood itself in the presence of other people. His hand was steady, and his posture was composed, and if you had walked into the room at that moment without context, you might have read it as an ordinary signing, an ordinary Saturday morning transaction. I knew otherwise. I had always known otherwise, which was the thing that had made 16 years of living beside him possible, and eventually impossible. He signed his name on page 7, then page 12, then the final page where the notarization line waited below his signature with the patience of a document that has been drafted carefully and knows it will eventually be executed. On the laptop screen, Helen looked down at her own copy. A pause of perhaps 4 seconds while she reviewed the pages against what she was seeing in the system. "Received," she said. "We're done here." She closed her side of the call without ceremony, which was exactly right. I took the second folder from the desk, the IRS documentation, the 9 years of financial records. The voluntary disclosure package that Helen had spent the better part of 3 months assembling, and I walked to the safe. I placed it inside behind the chronological folders, in the position I had designated for it when I had first decided how this meeting would end. I closed the safe door. I turned the combination. The lock engaged with the same clean sound it always made. "I'm keeping this," I said. "Not as a weapon. As an insurance policy in the event that you decide the next few months are an opportunity to make things difficult." Declan nodded. It was the nod of a man who understood the terms and had no remaining leverage with which to contest them, which is a different kind of nod than agreement, but produces the same practical outcome. He stood. He moved toward the door in the unhurried way of someone who has nowhere pressing to be and no performance left to give. I watched him cross the room. I had watched him cross many rooms over 16 years, had watched him work. A space claim. A space. Fill a space with the particular energy of a person who had learned early that presence was its own form of argument. This crossing was different. He moved through it the way you move through a room when you are no longer its audience and no longer its subject, when you are simply passing through on the way to whatever comes next. He reached the door. He stopped. He did not turn around. "Did you?" he said. "At the beginning." I looked at the line of his shoulders, the back of his jacket. The way he was standing very still with one hand on the doorframe and not looking at me because some questions are easier to ask when you don't have to watch them land. "Yes," I said. For a long time, it was true. I had given him that not as comfort, not as a final act of management, but because it was accurate and because he had asked in the only register that deserved an honest answer. The Declan who had stood in my father's apartment in 2007 with 2 cups of coffee and stayed through the night without being asked. The Declan who had known before I did what I was capable of building. Those versions had existed. They were not invented memories, not the kind of thing the mind constructs to soften what comes after. They had simply not been enough to survive what came after. He nodded once. Then he walked out. I sat in the office for a while after the door closed. There was no triumph in it. I want to be precise about that because the absence of triumph was itself something I had not entirely anticipated. I had prepared for relief for exhaustion, for the particular flatness that follows the completion of something you have worked toward for a sustained period. I had not prepared for how quiet it would be. Not the room. The room was quiet in the way it had always been quiet. The amplified silence of a large house on a Saturday morning. Something else. The quiet of a thing that had been running at considerable cost for a very long time finally stopped. I looked at the closed safe. I looked at the window where the morning light had shifted in the time we had been in this room, the angle changing as the sun continued its ordinary movement through the sky. Then I looked at the desk. The CEO contract was where Callum had left it on the right side of the desk surface, the cover page face up, the organizational chart visible through the semi-transparent first sheet. My name at the top, the title beneath it. The structure that had been built carefully and over time around the actual shape of what I could do. Vance Price Asset Group. One step remained. I picked up the pen. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in early October, I stood at the front door of the Hamptons property for the last time. Declan had moved out the day before efficiently without drama, which I considered one of his better qualities. He had taken what the settlement designated as his. Nothing else. The house was intact. The furniture, the art, everything I had selected and arranged over 2 years of making this space into something that worked remained exactly where I had put it. The rooms were full. I was the thing that was leaving. I went through it one more time. I started in the main hall under the chandelier. The Venetian glass caught the early October light differently than it had caught the September evening of the party cooler, now more direct. The kind of light that shows you the actual geometry of a thing rather than its atmosphere. Still beautiful. I had known it would be. I stood under it for 20 seconds and felt nothing that required me to stay longer, then moved on. The sitting room off the north hallway. The fireplace with the Vermont marble surround. The pair of chairs where Callum and I had sat 3 days ago. The document folder open on the low table between us. My name printed at the top of an organizational chart for the first time. The chairs were the same chairs. The room had already finished being what it was to me. The dressing room was last. I stood in the doorway and looked at it without going in. The silk blouses arranged by color. The wool coats in the climate section. 23 bags on the upper shelf, each in its dust cover, each representing a moment when an object had been offered in place of something that wasn't available in object form. I had worn all of them. There had been seasons when acquiring them had felt like evidence proof of a distance traveled from the apartment where my father and I had eaten dinner at a folding table because we couldn't afford anything larger. I understood standing in the doorway that I had never needed to travel that particular distance, that the folding table had not been a problem requiring a solution. I left all of it. From the house I took 3 things. The laptop from the office desk, my personal machine registered in my name, containing 14 years of work that belonged to me by any reasonable definition. The green notebook from the top drawer started in January 2022. Its pages dense with timelines and notations and the specific handwriting of a person building something in the margins of another life. And the key ring from the safe, the laptop, the notebook, the key. Everything worth carrying fit inside a canvas bag I had owned since 2009, the one my father gave me when I started my first real job. Broken clasp, my initials in faded marker on the inside flap. Written in his handwriting, I zipped it closed. At the front door I stopped. Not to speak to the house. Not to look back at any particular room. I stood on the threshold for the length of one full breath and let the feeling be whatever it was going to be. What it was. The stillness that follows the removal of a weight you have carried so long you stopped registering it as weight and began mistaking it for your own structure. The absence of something that had shaped you without your full consent finally visible because it was gone. I stepped outside. Callum's black Escalade was parked at the gate. He was standing beside it, not moving toward me, not at the door. Simply present the way reliable things are present. He had not called ahead. He had not sent a message. He was simply there the way he had been there in my father's apartment 17 years ago without announcement and without condition. When he saw me come through the gate, he opened the passenger door. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I got in. He walked around and got in. The car was warm. Outside, the October morning was doing what October mornings do in the Hamptons. Low light, the oaks beginning to turn at their edges, the color moving slowly from the outside of each leaf toward its center. He reached into the back seat and placed the contract folder on the console between us. I took the pen from my jacket pocket. I signed on the dashboard using the flat surface of the folder as support. I didn't read it again. I had read it carefully 3 days ago, and I knew exactly what it said, and what it meant, and what came next. I signed my full name on the line designated for the Chief Executive Officer of Vance Price Asset Group, the name my father had given me on a document that put it first. Callum looked at the signed page. "Ready," he said. "2 years ago," I said. He put the car in drive. I looked back once through the rear window. The house sat in the morning light the way it had always sat in morning light, composed certain. The white cedar shingles silvering at the edges in the salt air, the garden still and ordered, the ocean visible above the roofline, flat and blue and entirely indifferent to everything that had occurred inside those walls over the past 72 hours. Beautiful. It was still beautiful. It meant nothing to me now, not in the way of something sad, but in the way of something finished. I had left it cleanly, which was the only way I had ever wanted to leave anything. The house got smaller, then it was gone. Ahead was the road back to New York, and everything waiting there. Behind me was 14 years. And for the first time I could remember, I was looking forward without checking whether anyone was gaining on me. No one was. December in New York has a particular quality that September in the Hamptons does not. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Cold, direct, luminous in a way that looks beautiful from a distance, and slightly overwhelming up close. I had missed it more than I realized. The office on the 38th floor faced northwest, which meant Central Park in the foreground and the Upper West Side skyline beyond it. And on clear mornings, the light came in at an angle that made the whole view look like something someone had arranged deliberately. I had not arranged it. I had simply chosen the desk placement, the chair, and the single-framed photograph on the credenza. My father, 1987, standing outside the building where he worked his first year in this city, squinting into the sun with the expression of a man who has no idea what is coming and isn't afraid of it. The nameplate on the door was smaller than the door warranted. I had noticed this on my first day and had decided not to change it. 3 months in the mornings were still the thing I noticed most. Not the work itself. The work was familiar in its structure, built from the same components I had been assembling for other people's benefit for 14 years. What was different was the calendar. My name was at the top of the agenda for every meeting I attended, not because anyone had placed it there as a courtesy, but because the meetings existed because I had convened them. The decisions I made in the morning were still my decisions by afternoon. Nothing required confirmation from a separate authority. Nothing was attributed elsewhere after the fact. I had not understood until it was different how much of my mental bandwidth had been occupied by the management of that gap between what I built and whose name it carried. The gap was gone. The bandwidth had redistributed itself into the work, and the work had expanded to fill it. I was not caught up. I was not sure I ever intended to be. The notification arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December. Forbes Digital. The headline was visible in the preview without opening it. The Fall of a Brand Man. How Declan Vance Lost the Room. Below the headline, a thumbnail of a photograph I recognized, taken at an event 2 years ago. The expression on his face, that particular variety of confidence that reads differently once you know what was underneath it. I read the headline. I did not tap through to the article. I closed the notification and set my phone face down on the desk and returned to the contract summary I had been reading before it arrived. The contract summary was more immediately relevant to my Thursday than Declan Vance's media cycle, and I had learned was still learning. In the specific way that learning this kind of thing requires repetition, that not every piece of available information required my engagement. Some things could simply occur in the world without my participation. This was one of them. Callum came by the office at 4:30, which was when he usually came by when he was in the building, and had something worth saying in person rather than over email. He sat in the chair across from the desk, not the formal chair at the meeting table, the smaller one near the window. The one that had been there since the first week, and that he had apparently decided was his, and we talked through the Chicago project for 20 minutes. A commercial development group out of the Loop mixed use. The kind of deal that required someone who understood both the financial architecture and the relational landscape well enough to move them together. We talked about the Houston contact. We talked about what Q1 needed to look like if we were going to be positioned correctly by March. At 4:55, he stood up and said he'd send the revised projections before end of day. I said that worked. He left. There had been no moment in the conversation that was anything other than the conversation. No register beneath it, no management of subtext, no performance for an audience of two. Just two people who understood the same things talking about the work in front of them. It felt more correct than almost anything I could remember feeling in a professional context. Before I left for the evening, I opened the top drawer of the desk. The green notebook was where I kept it, not filed, not stored. Just present in the way of something that belongs in the room without requiring a formal designation. I had not written in it since October. I opened it anyway. The first page, January 2022, in the handwriting of a woman working in the margins of a life that didn't yet have space for this. What is actually mine? I turned to the last page. The final blank page, which had been waiting since I bought the notebook 3 years ago, accumulating its blankness through all the pages that had come before it. I picked up a pen and wrote one line, everything I chose to keep. I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Outside the window, Central Park was doing what Central Park does in December at 5 o'clock, the light going out of the sky slowly. The paths below still holding a few figures moving through the early dark, the first snow of the season coming down in the way that first snow comes lightly without urgency, as though it has nowhere specific to be and all the time available. I stood at the window for a moment. Then my phone rang. Chicago area code. The contact I had been expecting since Tuesday, the one who had said he'd call by end of week about a project starting in January. I looked at the screen for one full ring, let it go to the second. Not because I was busy, because I had learned that not everything needs to be answered in the first moment it arrives. I picked up. "This is Sarah Vance," I said. "Tell me about your project." My voice in the room saying my own name was steady and clear and entirely without apology, the way it sounds when you have stopped performing a version of yourself for an audience that no longer exists, and have simply become the thing you were building toward all along. I had not known it had sounded any other way until now. People always ask me, was it worth it? Here is what I learned somewhere in those 14 years. I confused endurance with loyalty. That is the real family betrayal no one warns you about. The slow erosion of your own permission to exist fully. There is a verse I return to now. "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a future and a hope." Hope is not something you wait for someone else to hand you. You build it quietly while they are not paying attention. So let me be direct. Don't be like me. Don't wait until the drawer opens itself. Don't spend years making someone else visible while disappearing yourself. Family betrayal accumulates slowly, silence by silence, document by document. And family revenge, when it finally comes, tastes less like victory than like the first morning that belongs entirely to you. Family revenge is not destruction. It is a reclamation. And family betrayal only wins if you let it define you longer than it deserves. My honest opinion. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who has been underestimated long enough to stop being angry about it. Family revenge begins the moment you decide your name belongs at the top. If this story stayed with you, comment, share, and subscribe. The next story goes deeper. Thank you for staying until the very end. Upcoming stories contain fictional elements created purely for educational purposes. If this content isn't for you, that's okay. Choose the journey that serves you best.
That's where this story ends. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.